The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Ontario children will not be back in class in person this school year. That was the province's decision announced this week. Tonight, why they made that call and what it means for students, parents, educators, and for the summer to come. Then, our Ontario Hubs explain the smart grid just approved for Sault Ste. Marie. And from wealth inequality to the terrible legacy of residential schools in this country, we've got the Agendas Week in Review. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. It's Friday, June 4th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Since mid-April in Ontario, students from kindergarten to grade 12 have been learning online only. If they should return back to the classroom has been hotly debated on all sides throughout the third wave of COVID-19. We heard finally this week that kids will finish the school year learning from home, not back in person. With us now for the details, both in Ontario's capital city, Caroline Alphonso, education reporter for the Global Mail, and Kristin Rushowy, Queen's Park reporter with a focus on education at the Toronto Star. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So this was the announcement that a lot of parents have been waiting for since April. I wanted to start our discussion first by showing the Premier's announcement on schools from this past Wednesday.
So today, I have to announce that schools will not be returning for in-class learning until the fall. I know this is difficult, very difficult news. It was a hard choice to make, but I will not, and I repeat, I will not take unnecessary risks with our children right now. The fact is, we're fighting a third wave driven by variants. And unlike the original strains, we know that some of the variants we're fighting right now are more dangerous for children.
I wanted to get both of your reactions from the Premier's announcement. Caroline, I'll start with you first.
I think, every parent across this province has been waiting for that announcement. Kids have been home since mid-April. I speak not only as the education reporter, but as a parent myself. I have two children who have been learning online since April. And, for some kids, it's been fine. They don't mind it. But I've heard from many, many parents that it's been really difficult for children to be at home, to be learning online every day. And I think, there was this hope among many that kids could return to the classroom, as they have in most other provinces, could return to the classroom for the month of June, not for really the academic side, but more for the social aspect of things. I know my kids are dying to see their friends and dying to see their teachers, and I think there was this anticipation that at least regionally that would happen, that kids in Thunder Bay and Kingston and Ottawa outside of the GTA could be back in school. So I think there was just some disappointment there.
We're going to talk about some of the reasons why the government says they made the decision that they made. But a lot of people, there's been, discussion around it's only a few weeks, it's not that big of a deal. Kristin, what was your reaction to the Premier's announcement that children will not be returning to in-person learning?
I think some people were surprised. I mean, last week we had the Premier ask for consensus. He reached out to public health units. He reached out to teacher unions. He heard from all of them. He heard from experts. He heard from Sick Kids Hospital, Children's Hospital in Eastern Ontario, the Canadian Pediatric Society. Everybody said, you know what, we support reopenings. Regionally, probably, given, low case numbers in places like Kingston and Thunder Bay, as Caroline mentioned. So there was a broad consensus. He did have support. And then at the end of the day, there were also whispers in his ear from business. He was worried about the economy. He was worried about the variants. He'd also heard from hospital CEOs who said, you know what, numbers are coming down, but the ICUs are still under pressure. And we're worried that if there is an increase in cases, that we might be swamped again. And, the science table had predicted a 6 to 11% increase in cases should all kids return to school. They felt it was manageable, but it was just a risk the Premier said he didn't want to take. And he didn't want to risk the reopening this summer.
You mentioned the letter that the Premier sent, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and myself, with my children, I've been telling them that they're not going back to school since April. I just didn't want to disappoint them. It's better, I guess, for me, in my mind, it's like it's better for them to be surprised. And Caroline, Dr. David Williams, the Chief Medical Officer, the Science Table, and many others, as Kristin has mentioned, they supported a reopening on a regional basis. Why is the government choosing a different path?
Yes, you're right. It's surprising that so many people, the broad consensus for a regional opening happened, even with the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. The president there said a regional opening. The premier's message was he sent this letter out to get a consensus. He got a consensus around a regional opening, but he said there were no guarantees that, we wouldn't see an increase in the number of cases by, I think he said, many, many thousands or thousands and thousands. So that's why they took a different path. They, there's whispers that the premier wants the economy to open or go into stage 1 here. And so, 3 weeks of school, some people think doesn't make a huge difference in the lives of kids to be home learning. Maybe a September start would be better. They can return to somewhat, hopefully, a normal school year. So that's the path that they decided to choose.
It just kind of feels like deja vu. We've been here before. We kind of heard the same story last May when we were told that schools were going to be closed indefinitely so that we could get ready for September. And Kristin, in that same press conference, Premier Ford that his government would use this extra time to get students and teachers vaccinated and also to invest in ventilation in schools. To what extent were they doing that before?
Well, certainly there's been money provided to school boards, and there was last summer for them to improve things like ventilation and things like that and upgrade windows, because we did hear from a lot of teachers who said, look, there are limiters on my window. I can't even open them more than a couple of inches. So the boards did do what they could over the summer. I mean, the Toronto District School Board said quite clearly, yes, we've got the money for ventilation, but, in order to procure it and to actually get it in place, this takes months. So, they did what they could. I think a lot of, sort of portable air filters and things like that. The federal and provincial governments have both ponied up some more money for this fall to, again, improve ventilation. So we should see some more work on that over this summer. I think we're also expecting to see cohorting. The province has talked about that. So keeping kids within a certain group and limiting their contacts. And I think we will also see still physical distancing and also masking when they return in the fall.
Now, during the press conference, the premier said that he had a conversation with a young Ontarian, and this young man wanted to have outdoor graduation ceremonies. Caroline, how were school boards reacting to this, that the premier is suggesting that boards have outdoor ceremonies?
I think there was a lot of frustration when school boards heard about this. Many of them, have been changing tactics all along. If the government announces something, they have to rejig their school calendars. They have to rejig cohorts, things like that. So this is sort of for them one more thing to have to deal with when we're so close to the end of the year. And now many school boards had already planned virtual graduation ceremonies as they had last spring. And so the plan was in the works. They had engaged students, they had engaged teachers in that. And I think there's a lot of frustration that, how do we do that? How do we do that when we have restrictions in place on how many people can gather outside? What if the weather changes and we have a graduation ceremony outside? What do we do in that case? How many people can we invite? So my sense is that, there was a press release from the Thames Valley School Board in London, Ontario yesterday that said, we are going to go ahead with our virtual graduation ceremonies, and we will wait for direction from the government on how to hold these in-person outdoor graduation ceremonies. So I think the sentiment right now is like, we're going to go ahead and we'll see what the government decides. We don't really have that much time to do it in, so who knows what's going to happen there.
Yeah, it seems kind of confusing because we still have outdoor restrictions. And Kristin, not to put you on the spot at all, but the Toronto Star, the Star editorial board had this to say in the Toronto Star. Ford should just level with students because of all his previous poor choices. He had to weigh their lives and futures against those of restaurants, bars, and small businesses, and they didn't come out on top. Every parent knows the fastest way to lose a child's trust is to mislead them. Perhaps Ford is banking on voters being more lenient or hoping that after a summer of patios, they won't remember the price students paid. Kristin, is the government putting the economy ahead of schools?
I think what the premier did was sort of weigh what was more important. And I think what they were hearing certainly in polling, I mean, Colin DeMello at CTV News was reporting on polling that showed, there wasn't a huge amount of support for reopening schools if it was going to delay reopening the economy. So they didn't even, voters didn't even approve a week's delay. So I think the premier weighed that against the threat of the variant, more cases, slowing down the economy, people not having a good summer, right? Everyone's pandemic weary. Kids are looking forward to going to camp. People are looking forward to having, maybe less restrictions this summer. So yes, it was a political decision. And I think too, they looked at the numbers, and in terms of elementary school parents, I think it was about 15% of the population. And, they said, yes, well, children's mental health is important. Everybody's mental health is important. And everyone's mental health is served by opening up the economy and returning to as normal as we can, as soon as we can.
Ontario has been closed the longest for schools. Other provinces have been able to keep their schools open. And one of the arguments that the premier made at the press conference was that because that we are a big province. Caroline, in your view, why have most other provinces been able to keep their schools open?
I think it's been a priority to keep schools open. We've heard through this entire pandemic the sentiment that schools should be the first to open, the last to close. And other provinces have done that. Even Alberta, that closed their schools for 2 weeks and then reopened right after. Nova Scotia, just a few weeks ago, said that it was closing schools through the end of the year, and kids would learn online. But then did not reverse. The cases went down and the lockdown or whatever they did worked. And so kids have now returned to the classroom. I think there is a priority because there's an understanding that kids need that connection with their teachers and their connection with their classmates, and being in the classroom is good for kids. It's hard for students to learn online all day. It's hard for them to sit in front of a computer. And I think other provinces have recognized that it's important that kids be in the classroom with their teacher for whatever time is left in the school year.
Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Education, we did try to get him on the program, but unfortunately we were told that there's no time to accommodate that. Kristin, your newspaper reported this week that Stephen Lecce, the Education Minister, was promising schools were safe since last November, but medical experts at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children were less certain. Can you give us the story behind that?
So this was based on work by two of my colleagues, Rachel Mendelson and Jenny Yang, and they did some Freedom of Information requests to see, what was going on last fall. Schools have been shut down from March to June, and kids returned in September. And, at that time, cases were lower, and Stephen Lecce and David Williams, they were saying schools were safe, not a big source of transmission. And that's been their message consistently all along. So in and around November, there was a meeting. And I guess at that point in time, there was not a lot of definitive data on it. They were saying, are schools safe? We don't know. Numbers were still low at that point, and the messaging still was schools were safe. Maybe that was based on other jurisdictions' experience, and also the fact that there didn't seem to be huge amounts of transmission, although there were several outbreaks. So I think at that time they were saying schools were safe. They didn't really have the data to back it up.
And also, I think when sorry, Caroline, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, Nam. I think, throughout this pandemic, one of the questions has always been, are schools safe? Researchers have been debating this, educators have been debating this, public health officials have been weighing in on this. And I don't think we can really answer that question, because I think the consensus is that schools are a reflection of what's happening in the community. And different jurisdictions have implemented different health measures and safety measures in schools. So there may be masking from kindergarten up here, and that may not be the case elsewhere. There's cohorting here, that may not be the case elsewhere. So I don't think, even with research studies, it's hard to determine sort of if it can be applied elsewhere. And I think, that question of, are schools safe? Well, I mean, we are in a pandemic. There are cases in the community, so there's going to be cases in schools inevitably.
And I think one of the, it came out maybe in December, because in COVID time, what is the month? And the suggestion was made that not enough testing was being done in schools to know if there were cases, because some of them could be asymptomatic. Kristin, when he was telling everybody that schools were safe, was this more about political posturing than anything else?
I believe what he was saying was based on what he was hearing from David Williams. And he was saying, I think his famous number was 99% of students had not been infected with COVID, COVID-free. That had been his consistent messaging, was that it was 90% plus, that everything was safe. Interestingly enough, when Premier Ford did send out his letter seeking consensus from all education stakeholders on whether to reopen schools or not, there was something in there that said, and this was new information, that schools were the biggest source of outbreaks in the month preceding April 20th. That came as a surprise. I think it was more than workplaces and everything else. And these were elementary schools. High schools were somewhat better. So that did come as a surprise. I think people didn't realize that. And it's certainly not something that was ever told to reporters and to the public at large. So were schools safe? I mean, in general, I think you could say some research has shown there wasn't a lot of transmission. But once you have the community numbers, as Caroline mentioned, it does come into schools. And I think that's why we saw the science table also predict that should students return, there could be an increase. And I think the Premier said about 2,000 to 4,000 cases.
Caroline, you actually asked the Premier if his government had misled the public about the safety of schools. What did he say?
He said, well, his response was no. He said that the new variants are taking hold, especially the new Delta variant, and there was concern about that. So I understand, Nam, that the science is changing, the science is evolving. I understand that there are new variants coming, and we have to be aware of that. So the Premier's response was he hadn't misled the public, that schools were safe. But as Chris said, that letter that he sent to public health officials and medical officers of health and teacher unions that said that schools were a large source of outbreaks. And so that kind of you just sort of juxtapose that with what he said previously, that schools were safe. You have questions around that now.
Going back to schools again, we've been hearing a lot. The government did announce that they were giving additional funding of $31 million, I believe, to help kids with mental health. We've been hearing a lot about that being one of the primary reasons why kids should go back to school. Caroline, what impact has remote learning had on children's mental health?
I mean, we have to remember, Nam, that about roughly a quarter of Ontario students chose remote learning back in September, or families chose remote learning back in September. So there have been a huge number of kids that have been doing it all along. We're starting to hear, I mean, being online is so difficult for 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. And we're starting to hear about kids sort of just disengaged, turning it off, having meltdowns at home, not being able to do this. And we're getting sort of a picture of learning loss among kids, especially young kids who are, you learn the fundamentals of reading in these early grades. And we're starting to hear that kids are disengaged from learning. I spoke with an attendance counselor up in Thunder Bay a month or so ago about what he's seeing. And remember, Thunder Bay schools have been closed longer than schools in Toronto and Peel. They've been closed since March. And, he has families that have completely disengaged from education, and it's just so difficult right now. And I think educators are starting to worry about September and starting to worry about what kids, with varying education levels. I mean, you always have summer learning loss. There's always that coming into the picture, but with varying education levels coming into the school system, and what is being done, if anything, to help mitigate those learning losses. I think that is now a growing worry for educators, especially in Ontario, where kids have been in and out of online learning throughout the academic year.
Kristin, do we know if the government is planning on addressing that learning loss?
So they have pledged some money for summer learning for math and a little bit for tutoring. What we are seeing from other jurisdictions, though, is much more comprehensive plans, especially around addressing the learning loss. In the UK, they're looking at adding 30 minutes a day to the school day, hiring tutors. I think Quebec and BC have also talked about hiring tutors to help students. Because if you look at it, I think in the Netherlands and over in the UK, they've looked at about 2 months learning loss. That's how far kids are behind. And with Ontario kids having been out for so much longer, by the end of June, they'll have been out for 26 weeks over the course of the pandemic. That's a long time. So 2 months learning loss. The Toronto District School Board, which is the country's largest board, did a look at the learning loss. They found that kids in grade 1 were about 3 percentage points behind in reading. High school students had held pretty steady, but if they were already vulnerable or already struggling, they were struggling more so. Caroline also mentioned the issue of absenteeism, and there's also the issue of ghosting, right? Which is where kids log on, right? They kind of sign in, say that they're there, and then the camera's off, and then they're not taking part in school. So there is that whole issue of disengagement that I know schools are concerned about, and that they are going to have to address in some form in the fall.
I think I know two people who do that in my household. But Caroline, go ahead.
I hope mine are paying attention, but who knows sometimes. But, there are educators who are calling for reviewing the Ontario curriculum, reviewing the kindergarten to right up to grade 12 if you have to, reviewing the curriculum to make sure that there's some sort of scaffolding that happens at the beginning of the year next year to sort of, know where kids are at from the previous grade. And that needs to be done now. That needs to be done early enough. And there hasn't been any movement to do anything like that. There has been money, as Chris said, to pledge to remediation, to summer learning, but those are dollars sent to school boards, right? And they have to figure it out, which they will, I'm sure, but there's no provincial plan around this. And I think that's what educators especially and researchers are calling for, some sort of provincial initiative to address these issues.
And Kristin, a Financial Accountability Office report recently found that the province is $12 billion short in its education spending plan. We've been hearing from the government saying that they've invested more money than anyone else. What does that mean for students going forward if there is a $12 billion short in its education spending plan?
So the report from the FAO did say that it was 12 billion short. That's over the next decade, and they're looking at what the government is planning on spending versus what they think they will spend, looking at inflation, looking at salaries and things like that. Because it's costed out over the next decade, we have an election next year and another one before that happens, so we could have a change of government a couple of times. So, we can look at the numbers that way, but there's also concern that there's not enough funding there to even cover inflation. That's something we've heard from the unions, and that's something we've also heard from the opposition critics. Initially, boards were told they weren't getting any extra COVID money. Now they are. The government's pledged about $1.6 billion to help with COVID funding, and boards are allowed to spend about half of it because we're just going to see how things progress throughout the year, so that we will see things like improved ventilation, and it's for personal protective equipment and things like that.
I have about a minute left, and I wanted to just get from you, maybe 30 seconds from each of you. You speak to parents. We've been talking about this, kids upstairs and everything. Moving forward to September, what do you think is the thing that's top of mind for parents? Caroline, I'll start with you.
I think parents want their children in school. I think as normal as a year that we can give them after a year of disruptions, I think parents just want everything in place so that their kids can be in school in September. Parents have taken on the role of teacher as parent, and they just want their kids to be happy and in the school system.
And Kristin?
Yes, definitely want to return to normal as we can. I think a lot of things we hear also from parents and students is they want extracurriculars. They want their clubs, they want their sports, which have obviously been curtailed this year. They want their grads, they want their proms. So those are kind of the things that they're looking for, and that connectedness with their school.
Kristin and Caroline, thank you so much. And thank you for all the terrific work you've been doing through this pandemic. We really do appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Nam.
Thanks, Nam.
The Ontario Energy Board just approved the construction of the Sault Smart Grid, the largest project of its kind in North America. Nick Dunne covers the Northeast for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us now from Sudbury for more. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Joanne.
All right, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is a smart grid?
Well, let's back that up even further and talk about what the electric grid is. The electric grid is the distribution from the power plant all the way to your home. So those giant transmission lines that go down the highway all the way to those substations, those giant boxes with all the electric wires flying around everywhere to your hydro poles that you see on your street that connect into your house. That is the electric grid, the entirety of that system. A smart grid, on the other hand, is still that system, but it's applying various smart technologies using internet-enabled communication between the meter in your home, components on the grid, various parts of the grid, and across to the central control station of this distribution grid. And basically, using various automation processes and being able to live read energy usage at any given moment, from anyone's home to your largest businesses in town, you can dynamically control and make it more efficient through various processes. That's it in a nutshell.
Now, for your article for TVA.org, you're talking about the smart grid in Sault Ste. Marie, but have there been sort of smart grids elsewhere in Ontario?
Yeah, they've definitely been applied in a lot of pilot projects across the GTA. There have been some in Ottawa. I mean, they're quite numerous across Canada and especially in the United States. There are some very large projects in, Southern California, but what makes the Sault Smart Grid project unique is that they're applying a multitude of different technologies all at once in a fairly compressed time period, about a year. And it's going to be applied to the entirety of its grid. So as a percentage of the utility itself, there are possibly larger projects out there, but relative to its size, it's an incredibly ambitious project.
I think a lot of people are probably going to be asking, why Sault Ste. Marie? Why is this project not being done elsewhere? What is it about the Sault that makes it sort of ideal for this sort of project?
Right. So the city of Sault Ste. Marie in 2008 declared themselves the alternative energy capital of North America. They are a net producer on the grid, and they have some of the largest wind and hydroelectric plants in the province. So they've really invested in this kind of energy. And PUC Utilities, their utility distribution company, is owned by the city. So they've really invested, I guess, to further that branding, I suppose, and invest in their infrastructure to realize some cost savings down the road, not only for them, but for customers as well.
Now, when we talk about the smart grid, do we know how many people this will be serving when we talk about residents and businesses?
This is going to serve the entirety of the customer base, so about 33,000 homes. And a whole wide variety of businesses, including Algoma Steel, which is obviously a huge consumer of electricity. Melting iron down and processing into steel and producing it requires a ton of energy. So this is going to be across the entirety of the grid.
And when we talk about, residents, what are we going to see in terms of benefits? I think at the end of the day, when we see something like a smart grid, we want to know, are we actually saving dollars and cents, and what actually will those figures look like? So what can we see as homeowners and business owners?
Yeah, there's some really interesting things here. So the first one I'd like to talk about is distribution automation. Traditionally, if there was a power outage, your crew would have to go and manually locate what the source of that power outage was. Was it a tree? Was it an animal? Was there some issue with the transformer? This would take time. They'd have to go street by street, try to locate and figure out the size of the outage. And then they'd have to manually reroute power, manually repair it. And this could take hours, sometimes even days. I mean, we've seen that, in the south of the United States. What the smart grid can do, when used properly, is automatically reroute the power and also find where that outage is precisely. So it saves a lot of time for crews who can fix it, and it'll automatically restore power. Now, maybe, during a power outage, you're boiling some tea and you can't do that anymore. But, you got to think about, hospitals, data centers, all these essential services, even your street lights, right? outages can be extremely dangerous and interruptive. The second one is voltage VAR optimization. Now, this one's a little bit technical, but basically there are certain utilities, appliances in your household that use more energy than they actually need. They have to create an electromagnetic field, to generate electricity, and this causes some energy inefficiencies. There are ways to regulate that, to minimize it on the grid, but this process using the live metering that every household has, the utility can see the energy usage of every household and calibrate it in such a way that you're going to be using less electricity to power your certain appliances. So this actually will result in some savings down the road. It'll affect larger utilities and larger energy consumers a little bit more, but as we see a more electric society, where even your fridge has a computer, you're going to be charging your car in your storage unit. This can, even the small percentage, 2.7% is what they're estimating in their total savings across the grid for energy consumption. This is saving $2 million a year and something like 2,800 tons of carbon emissions per year. So it really does realize pretty major savings when applied.
I want to talk about a little bit about that. You say the project is hoping to be wrapped up by the end of next year. Was there any opposition to the project, or was it pretty much smooth sailing?
Certainly. So there were certain interveners on the Ontario Energy Board's decision, one of them being the Vulnerable Energy Consumers of Canada. They feel as though the project may be a little bit too ambitious in terms of how it's planning to time it and deliver it, and within that year. They'd rather see a phased approach, but they're taking this faster approach to secure Natural Resources Canada funding, about $11 million. And they see this, to secure that money, they have to operate within a certain time frame. And that is going to, they feel, the utility, save the money in the long run, as opposed to applying this over a 10-year period.
Now we have about 30 seconds left. I do want to know, this project is just getting underway. Is there anything to be learned from this smart grid project that can be applied elsewhere?
It's very interesting. There's a dual need for utilities to, on one hand, be innovative and try to save energy. They deal with huge amounts of power, and there's huge savings that can be realized there, to reduce our emissions. However, utilities are also an essential service. A jump in your utility bill can, drive you out your home. It can shut down your business. So there are these very serious considerations and two very opposing forces here that have to be considered. But as these technologies have become more advanced, they become more technically sound. I think we're going to see this applied across the country. And Sault Ste. Marie has certainly taken a pretty big step forward here in this new utility project.
Some really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for this, Nick.
The agenda this week looked at the case for wealth redistribution and, a year out from an election, how big events can shape political fortunes. The agenda's week in review begins reflecting on the legacy of Indigenous residential schools in this country.
Just before we start, we thought it might be useful for residential school survivors and others affected. If you need support, there is a nationwide residential school crisis line that you can contact. And here comes the phone number. It's 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. That number will appear on the screen as our discussion proceeds. And if you need help, please call that number. I want to start with a quote from National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations, who said the other day, survivors have been saying that there were a lot of deaths, a lot of burials, and a lot of unmarked graves, not only in Kamloops, but in all the residential schools. The sad part is nobody believed them. Now here's your concrete, tragic, horrific evidence of 215 bodies that have been found. That's Perry Bellegarde. And let's follow that up with a quote from Saul Mamakwa, the MPP from Kiwanuka in Northern Ontario, who said, "It is a great open secret that our children lie on the properties of the former schools, an open secret that Canadians can no longer look away from. Let's see here. Cynthia, I'm not sure there's a better place to start other than just saying what's been going through your head over the last week.
Well, just exactly that this is something that nobody can now look away from. It reminds me of the Blackwater brothers when they first took their case to the courts, and the courts called them liars, that there was no way that the kinds of things that they said happened at residential schools happened. And they were vindicated in the end, and they were actually listened to. And now here we are with these children, and we've been talking about these children ever since, all the way back from residential schools, and now there's somebody that believes. So I've seen a lot of ceremony happening this week. There's been a lot of sadness. I have a granddaughter. My daughter is very upset, like this could have been us. So I think there's a lot going on across the country and a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings.
Rye, how about you?
I'd just echo everything that Cynthia has said. And I think for me personally, it's actually affected me quite profoundly, I would say. And I've had so many different layers of emotion that I've been working through. And one of them is this deep sadness. Another is just this deep frustration and really almost anger, because when I was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I was on the statement gathering teams, I was on the document collection teams. A huge part of the work that I've been doing over the last decade was specifically to create the evidentiary record to give us this opportunity to understand what's going on here right now. And I think about all the survivors that talk to us about this very story, about their loved ones disappearing, about what happened to babies that were born in the schools as a product of sexual abuse. I mean, these were absolutely horrific stories that we heard over and over and over again, and it felt like we were shouting into the dark for so long. So I'm pleased in a way that Canada has finally had its eyes opened and cannot look away. But I have to admit, it's frustrating that it's taken as long as it has, because survivors have been consistently and reliably telling the truth the entire way along, and we have to make sure that we continue to listen to them and believe them.
Connie.
Yeah, I think, it's been a really difficult week for a lot of reasons. My father was a residential school survivor. Both of my grandparents were at residential schools. And I think, what's definitely started during the work of the Truth and Reconciliation, but what has certainly continued has been a transformation in this country in terms of the understanding of those truths of residential school survivors. And I think this week, as difficult as it was, felt different to me in that, I think that a lot of people outside of my family and my native circle are paying attention to this and caring about this in a way that I haven't seen before. But I think there's also been a lot of sharing from Indigenous people across the country about those traumas and about the traumas that residential schools set into motion, and the intergenerational trauma that continues to harm and hurt so many families and communities. And it's been difficult to bear witness to that. To be completely honest, over the last week, it's been quite hard.
Cynthia, is this finally the moment of national reckoning that so many Indigenous people have been waiting for?
I think it's the beginning of the national reckoning, because now people have evidence, and so that's a very important part of this conversation. But also, it's not done. So there's still almost 400 other schools that have to be brought into this conversation. There's compensation that needs to be looked at. There's survivors that are really struggling with this that need some care. So this has just opened up larger and broader the conversation that we've been having over the last 20 years. Really, I think it's kind of started with Phil Fontaine's opening, but we're now deeply into it, and I think it's going to go deeper. And I think Canada had better be ready, because now the truth, capital T, is coming forward.
I don't want to assume that everybody has a really good understanding of the history of residential schools in this country. So we are just going to take a moment here to bring up some information that people may not know. And Tony Burke, if you would, you're directing today, if you could bring up this information. From the 1870s to 1996, as many as 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children were sent to so-called residential schools funded by the federal government and often run by various churches. A total of 139 schools were identified in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. This does not include those run by provincial governments and religious orders. Most were out west, but as the map indicates, 16 of these schools were in the province of Ontario. Next bit of information. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released its final report 6 years ago, identified more than 4,000, maybe as many as 6,000 children at residential schools who died. But Murray Sinclair, the former head of the commission, now says the number could be as high as 25,000. And the cause of death in most cases was disease, mainly tuberculosis, but abuse was a factor. Accidents were a factor. For example, fires breaking out in unsafe buildings. The deadliest years at residential schools were from the 1870s to the 1920s, but even as late as the 1940s, the death rates in the schools were up to 5 times higher than among the general Canadian population of kids as a whole. And 1/3 of the children who died, 1/3, did not even have their names recorded by school administrators. Now, Rai, you led the creation of a national archive that documented what residential school survivors experienced. What conditions in these schools would have allowed for these kinds of things to happen?
Yeah, Steve, that's a really important point that you've raised, because when we even think about something like tuberculosis, we have to understand that there's a whole bunch of factors playing out inside of these schools that are contributing to the spread, dissemination of disease. So this is all well documented in survivor statements and survivor accounts. And first of all, we have to understand the schools as being filled full of abuse and trauma. So you are not going to be well when you are being subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse on a regular and daily basis.
Ever since Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, was released about 4 years ago, people have been talking about income inequality in a much more significant way, and how the top 1% of income earners have a much disproportionately higher share of the world's total wealth than the other 99%. So let's say a decade later, have we made any progress on that problem?
No, we're going in the wrong direction, I think, and the coronavirus has just amplified that inequality problem on a global scale. And I think that's worrisome, not only because, as the other speakers have noted, it has left some Canadians behind and maybe confused us about what we think where the problems of our society come from and how much control we think we have over them. So I think that Piketty, he talks about the historical trends of wealth and gives us a warning as to what happens when you get too much wealth concentration. And the Matthew Klein and Michael Pettit's book amplifies that and shows us that we aren't thinking correctly about whether we can solve these problems and how. We think this is a trade issue and this is about balance of payments or terms of trade, but actually it's a lot more about our central core decision to be an open market, a free market in an open economy, in a globalized economy that we can't control. And so when China allows consumers surplus to be swept up into production and not into consumer spending, that Chinese workers are hurt by that, but so are Canadian workers. And we don't control China's policies any more than we control the US, but we're affected in different ways by both of those countries.
Michael, I wonder if you'd weigh in on that as well. There seems to be a consensus that we have, despite 10 years of considerable discussion, maybe going back as far as Occupy Wall Street and so on, after a decade of very focused conversation on what to do about the 1%, that we haven't seemed to make any progress at all. In fact, things may have gotten worse. Why is that?
Hard problem to solve. I think that we have tried to redistribute, but at a certain point, it becomes harder and harder to do that because the mechanisms against redistribution, essentially behavior of the people who get taxed more, can change more and more. So it's just a difficult problem for us to solve. I don't think we should think of ourselves as being a society that doesn't do a lot in that direction, but to do more and more gets harder and harder.
Robin, do you think it is the role and responsibility of governments around the world to redistribute wealth?
Yeah, I think redistribution is an important factor in all of this, but I think redistribution can happen on multiple levels. There's the tax and transfer redistribution that I think we're very comfortable with, but there's also the distribution of economic opportunity and economic access. And for me, a lot of what we're talking about here really boils down to concentrations in corporate power and trends that we're seeing towards more concentrated industries and economies. And this is critical as a trend because it can be a major driver of the inequality that we're seeing today. And this is because as our economies become more concentrated, they become increasingly dominated by a smaller number of bigger firms. And when these firms are in a dominant position, they're better able to extract wealth and income from people lower down on the income distribution and redistribute that wealth and income up to the wealthiest. And in this way, we're seeing a real mechanism of inequality at play. And what is so interesting about this problem is that there are solutions. One of the solutions that we should be exploring is making tougher competition laws that not only control and rein in dominance of firms, but also in that process, providing more opportunities for people to participate in the economy as entrepreneurs, as workers receiving fair wages. And in that way, we can help ameliorate the rise of inequality that we're seeing.
Well, Allison, I know how much you love tax law. You love it so much that I think you have a mug somewhere on your desk that proves how much you love it. As she reaches for it now and shows us, Isis, there we go. Okay. So we know how much you love tax law. I can imagine people watching this or listening to this right now saying to themselves, look, this should be an easy problem to solve. All the Western governments simply need to get together and say, we're going to raise corporate taxes by this much. We're going to raise taxes on the super rich that much. If we all do it together, nobody has an unfair advantage. Boom, let's just do it. Why not?
Yeah, easy. Sure. Yeah, that's not going to happen. And why? Because not everybody loves tax law. In fact, most people really hate tax law, and for lots of good reasons, I suppose. But one of the main reasons that people think that this is not a good idea is that they worry that we're not going to be redistributing in the right way, or we're going to waste our money or something like this, or all kinds of ideologies about why we shouldn't have taxes on the rich, or we shouldn't raise taxes here or there or from corporations. I mean, the short answer is that there is a global discussion taking place about the level of corporate tax and the distribution of corporate tax, which may or may not change, what's going on here in Canada. But the book that we've read for today, that tells us that trade wars are class wars, I think could have an extra line, which are tax wars. Class wars are tax wars. They always have been. It's always a battle of vested interests, as the book talks about them. People like the way things are when it works out for them, and they don't want it to change. And for those for whom the system is not working, agitating for change is working against some pretty strongly held beliefs and some very strong vested interests. So it's not that easy to change, even though, yes, 100% that is what we should do. We should be lowering taxes on consumers, getting more spending ability in regular households, lowering income taxes for workers, and raising them for those with higher incomes and in capital.
We have seen again where a couple of premiers in the past that we've named, Bob Rae, Kathleen Wynne, for example, their popularity went way down and they were unable, regardless of what they tried, to bring it back up. We have seen other premiers whose popularity really takes a dive, and I think of Bill Davis in 1975. I think of Dalton McGuinty in 2007. They're going into their second terms. They look like they're dead ducks, and somehow they figure out a way to bring it back, and they win again. What are the conditions that allowed them to do that?
Well, I think it's what Premier Davis did after the Senate, because in 71, big majority, and then almost lost it all in 75, when there was a series of things that people thought were scandals and whatever, and he was pictured in a pinstripe suit with a cigar, all this, you know. And what they did after 75, I mean, he hired a couple of really smart people, Hugh Siegel, who we've seen on this show many times, Sally Barnes, a number of other, Ed Stewart. And what they did was remake him in a way that the authentic Bill Davis came out. So that, you know, described often as Brampton Billy, in an affectionate way. And he kind of turned into your sort of famous or a favorite uncle, if I can put it that way. And so it just a complete strategic assessment of what was wrong, where are we, what mistakes have we made, what can we learn from them, what can we put out there that will change the story, change the narrative. And they did a superb job. And of course, I think one of the reasons it worked was because it was Bill Davis. I mean, you can't build a persona with a politician that isn't real, because sooner or later the voters see through that. So it was something that was very, I think, legitimate, fit the times, fit his persona, and also to fit his style of governing, because it was minority in 75 and again in 77. And they actually, he was one of those politicians that was able to work across the aisle. I think voters, even though when you look at some voting results in the States, you kind of wonder about this, but frequently voters like a politician who is not a hard partisan, who can actually seem to be reasonable and reach across the aisle. And I think Bill Davis could be, even though he was partisan, could be a very, very good and very adept at that.
Tim, what are the different conditions that you see that allow some leaders who appear to be toast to come back?
So I go back to my sort of three kinds of blunders: character, strategy, and policy. And I think generally it's, I think to Janet's point, what Bill Davis managed to do was reset all three. He did that post-election in 75, because I think he carried the image of, frankly, slightly out of touch, arrogant, the cigar smoking, and they completely reset his character. But they also did some major policy shifts around things like rent control on the Spadina Expressway, and a set of things that moved him, in essence, more to the center from a policy point of view, and from a strategy point of view, tried to kind of make him, in a personal sense, more a person of the middle in Ontario, which he clearly kind of, occupied significantly until, effectively David Peterson beat Frank Miller, 10 years later. I think Bob Rae in 1995 had a different problem. He didn't actually have a character problem, in my view. I think he set out on a policy path in the face of an enormous recession that I think alienated some of his core, and was just, frankly, the kind of one in an accidental sense, and was never able to get out of the policy and events trap that framed him. And I think, and then you could rush forward to Kathleen Wynne, who carried some considerable unpopularity into that election, but was 14 plus 15 years into a government. And, sometimes just the weight of decisions and events and the challenges you create, you just can't get over. And I think that was something that was unfixable. Yeah. And her character, I think, was something that was fixed in the public mind and also not unfixable or not fixable.
I do want Robert to pick up on that. But before you do, it just popped into my head that tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Bill Davis's speech to stop the Spadina Expressway, and that speech, almost as much as anything, helped him win the 1971 majority government that he'd go on to win in October.
Yeah.
Anyways, that little aside. Okay, Robert, pick up the story from this vantage point, and it really comes from the end of what Tim was saying. How much of a factor in whether you've got a shot to be elected or reelected is carrying the water of your predecessors?
Oh, it's a huge factor, Steve. I think to Tim's point, Kathleen Wynne won a surprise majority. I think a lot of us were surprised in 2014 when she seized victory from the jaws of defeat. Because remember, in 2013, when Dalton McGuinty finally left, that was a government that was embroiled in the gas plants debacle and had a lot of mileage on it. Mr. McGuinty had been around for almost a decade, and I think that people were ready for a change. And Premier Wynne really resuscitated her party with the help of folks like Tim, frankly. And it was that 2014 was a really big victory for the Liberals and a surprising one. However, the hangover of the McGuinty years, I think, caught up with Ms. Wynne in 2018. And I think it was weird. People were talking about the gas plants affair in the 2018 election, and those of us in the cognoscenti had thought it was really kind of resolved after 2013, and it just wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, not to pick on Tim, but Tim had to deal with this with Paul Martin as well. Like, Paul Martin had to carry a lot of water for Jean Chrétien's problems. John Turner had to carry Pierre Trudeau's water. I mean, it's just one of the things that sometimes happens. Janet knows this. She was Ernie Eves's finance minister. So there were issues that that government had to deal with, that Premier Eves had to deal with, that weren't his fault, they were to do with Mike Harris, his predecessor. So it's one of these things that when you get into dynasties, and Bill Davis really is the survivor, the remarkable one, that he was able to go take all of the things that had happened under John Robarts and his predecessors, Leslie Frost and others, and not wear them. And in fact, I still believe that if Mr. Davis hadn't retired in 1984, the Tories would have won a majority in 1985.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, June 4th, 2021. It was a truly unusual legislative sitting due to COVID-19. Monday, we'll look at what got done at Queen's Park this session. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.